2 years ago, I stumbled upon a mystery surrounding a unique Yu-Gi-Oh game from over 20 years ago, the Duelist of the Roses and its strange password system. Sadly, despite seeming so close to solving the mysteries of this mechanic, specifically the origins of 4 powerful card passwords within the small set of those ever released officially, the journey ended without resolution. However, I continued searching, and with the help of both old and new friends who heard this story, we've discovered answers, but along with it, even more mysteries. So today, I'm going to tell you all about the lengths we've gone through to uncover the secrets of these passwords, and furthermore, the fascinating details our journey has unearthed from this decades-old game. But first, we need to set the stage for this ancient duel. So to recap the situation, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses isn't just different due to its absurd setting, story, or dueling mechanics, as the creators tried to spice up one of the foundational elements of most Yu-Gi-Oh! Games thus far in the series and beyond, the password system. The password is a feature that Konami used to tie in the physical cards we all know and love, allowing us to enter the 8-digit numerical codes found on the lower left corner of cards into the games, usually from an easily accessible menu option. In Roses, however, not only was the system a bit more hidden, requiring one to inexplicably hit R3 in the deck build menu to access, the passwords for your favorite Yu-Gi-Oh cards no longer worked, as each included card had its unique physical code replaced with a new alphanumeric one instead. But that was just the start, as these new codes were not only inherently less accessible without the physical tie-in, but they were almost entirely unobtainable, as only 34 were ever known to be released officially by Konami. We only ever even gained confirmation that all other cards had passwords, and what they were 16 years after the game originally released, when community member Generic Mad Scientist, or GMS, dug into the game's assembly using PSCX2 to find them. And despite this also explaining many other previously unknown or misunderstood game mechanics, in no way did it answer why only 34 codes were ever released, especially given there were 820 more cards in the game that now have verifiable passwords, with some even being flagged to prevent their use in-game anyways. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because as you might recall, our mystery was in regards to specifically 4 of the released codes, those for Crush Card Virus, Royal Decree, Change of Heart, and Gravity Bind. Because while the origins of the other 30 originally known passwords came from the end screens of Rose's predecessor Forbidden Memories, and Roses itself, alongside the official Konami website for the game, nothing else I researched ranging from message boards, FAQs, guidebooks, or Shonen Jump magazines led me to find where these 4 were distributed, or any definitive answer as to what was going on with all of this in the first place. At least until after releasing the first video on this mystery, at which point I got a lead for something I completely forgot about, because while I had been trying to find any mention of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Roses within Shonen Jump volumes of the era, it was suggested I check V-Jump, a mostly monthly magazine under the Jump umbrella focused on gaming. In particular, this magazine tended to host spin-off manga, game guides, and card game coverage. And after a bit of digging into this topic, it became clear that these less popular spin-off magazines weren't going to be any easier to find scans of, and sometimes were even rarer than the much more frequent but far more popular mainline Shonen Jump magazines. Luckily, since the focus of these books was on gaming, checking the covers might lead to a mention of our beloved game. And just like that, thanks to online release archives like Comic Vine, we found that the November 2001 issue featuring Yugi and Slifer mentions 3 Yu-Gi-Oh! Topics: new cards for the OCG, info for the GBA title DM6, and of course, information on Shin DM2, aka Roses. In fact, every V-Jump cover since August also mentions the game, and the last cover mention is found in the following December issue. But sadly, this left us in a similar predicament to before. Since any of these volumes could hold the missing passwords, we only know that these 5 are guaranteed to discuss Roses in some way. However, there is one more detail about the covers, because while the first 3 only name-drop the game or mention a giveaway, the final 2 specifically mention an appendix, and given these were released after the game, at which point other passwords were being released on the website regularly, it seemed our best place to start. Now, something I was concerned about is that V-Jumps often came with an insert, which were mini game guides, and this appears to be what the covers are referring to. For the only listings of either issue I could find at the time, December specifically states this insert is not there, while November does not clarify. Now, although I have found a few of these for other issues and games, they also don't seem very common, let alone purchasable on their own for our 2 issues of interest. Thus, with no other leads left, the November listings seemed like our best shot. So after putting in an order via a proxy service, our first Roses-related delivery since 2023 was on its way a few days later. And for as goofy as some of these volume covers are, often reusing animation shots, this cover did not disappoint, nor did its contents, filled with many nostalgic info drops for new games around the time, like previews of Kingdom Hearts' early game or a huge amount of info on Melee and its moves. But on top of all that, tucked inside the folded section near the front was a panel on roses, covering the methods for obtaining all 5 Exodia pieces, one of which being for the single limb that was known to have been distributed, giving us the first proof that Rose's passwords could in fact be in Jump-branded magazines. However, since this isn't one of our 4 lacking in origin, that means this password already had a documented distribution, specifically from the official websites where they also covered this same Exodia information. But this was clearly not an insert supplement, nor was there any trace of something like it in this package. And that's where our worst fear comes into play, as the only other Yu-Gi-Oh! Game news here is a 2-page spread covering what would release just 1 month later, DM6 for the GBA, but nothing else on Roses was found across these pages. That is, aside from a single name drop below the table of contents. This section serves only to display which titles are covered in those V-Jump inserts mentioned earlier, revealing that this issue did in fact contain Rose's info and is now more likely than ever to have password information, potentially the exact 4 we are in search of, or just more duplicates. And after spending even more hours searching Japanese marketplace sites for either of these month's inserts, or any from this era for that matter, I feel confident saying it's not likely we find these, as again almost no V-Jump issues listed include their insert, and searching for inserts themselves hasn't led me to those we need. And with the already scarce listings of these specific V-Jump issues, or most from this era and earlier, it seemed almost impossible we could find one for purchase this way. Somehow complicating this situation even further, that single V-Jump password also supports the idea that any issue in the tens of weekly Jump magazines released during Rose's promotional cycle could still be a source of the last 4 known passwords, or contain nothing but information we already knew from the site. That is, of course, if these books had anything at all. But then I received a comment, which started to change everything, from a user going by the name Maru, who, after coming across the original video, was inspired to help out on this search. Using her knowledge of the Japanese language and research skills as a grad student in Japan, she discovered an online thread from before the password dump compiling Rose's information, which had a list of the 34 known passwords, and cited where each came from, something we had never seen before. This list claims that the November and December V-Jump issues did contain more passwords, but all were duplicates from the website as we theorized. But finally states that the 4 missing passwords were in fact in a weekly Shonen Jump magazine, the number 45 2001 issue, one that had been listed at the time of my original search, but had no images or info suggesting any Rose's information was present. But thanks to Maru's fantastic research skills, using a combination of keywords and search options that led to this specific page hit, we finally had our answer. Presuming this was all true, of course. Now, there seemed to be little chance the information in this 2009 thread was wrong given the password origins correctly identified here, however we knew we had to try and verify the claim to truly solve this part of the mystery. Luckily, listings for these books could be found online, but Maru again helped out here as she was aware of the incredible Kyoto Manga Museum, which houses a Shonen Jump archive that did include our issue of interest. Generously, Maru offered to stop by and check it out for us as she was studying nearby at the time. Thus, just a few days later, Maru and her husband made the trip for us to see what they could find. Sadly though, despite there being a great deal of open shelves across the museum for reading, we were all unaware that the Jump Archive required a 1-week reservation to view. So to save herself another trip and further trouble, Maru activated their trap card, grabbing a much cheaper copy of the volume from Mercari, and just a few days later, Maru's package arrived, and she quickly shared with me what was inside. This 2 decades old magazine held a single page dedicated to roses and the distribution of passwords, fully focused on those last 4 powerful cards we had been in search of all this time. Both of us were so excited to finally have this solved, after at one point seeming like we might never find the distribution method, let alone see these 4 cards referenced. And then Maru even offered to ship it over to us for further documentation. So after sending her some funds for the shipment, and to cover the book plus museum trip, what could be our final roses package was well on its way. Once I finally got to take a look at this old Jump magazine myself, the roses page, adverts for the then recently released Struggle of Chaos cards, and of course the beautiful Yu-Gi-Oh chapter which held the first look at Battle City's climactic setting, I really was taken aback at the journey and how far we had come in tracking down these last 4 password origins. Back when we first thought the answers might lie in these books, it seemed impossible that we would be able to check all of them, let alone find the right one. But thanks to so many people's support with the video and search, we finally had this answer with solid documentation in hand. And back to these 4 cards alongside their passwords that were for a time seemingly lost. An important question still was why these cards were so exclusive compared to the duplicate VJump passwords or other freebies. However, it seems our original theory that cards with meta relevance in the physical game and appearances in multiple other mediums of the franchise like these 4 might be packaged together purposefully was on track, as their page highlights the power of each card and correctly explains to players that they can only be obtained via the password system. So finally, with these last 4 password origins documented alongside clear intent in their distribution, we get to put an end to this long, exhausting duel. However, that was just the first game, because we now had confirmation of the distribution method for all 34 passwords ever revealed, and this documentation corroborates that there were no others. In fact, after Maru's help, I even received one more source thanks to a couple Yugipedia users, including XMetaman, a huge contributor of the site to this day, who, across their Yugi archiving, had saved a Japanese blog of the era, which also held the same password distribution info. And remember, uncovering the origin of the distributed passwords was simply our best way to try and confirm that there was nothing else ever released on this matter. Thus, it's now only more puzzling that the remaining cards were left with functionally non-working passwords. So there was nothing left to do but continue my investigation into the oddity of Rose's password system, which has led me to even more discoveries surrounding the development of Yu-Gi-Oh's strangest video game ever released. The starting play of our post-4 card arc is understanding why the password system was so different from other games to begin with. As you might have guessed, there is essentially zero documentation on this game from the creative team that I could find. However, that doesn't seem required to understand this, because the password system in Yu-Gi-Oh games is generally notorious for being abusable, allowing players access to powerful cards, often from the very start of the game, with zero cost. And while that alone might be enough to suggest the devs wanted to make cards less password accessible, we have even more, because Roses itself isn't a lengthy game. While there is plenty to learn in terms of the board mechanics and card collecting, one only needs to defeat about 10 opponents on either side of the game before reaching the end, unlike its predecessor, Forbidden Memories, which requires an absurd amount of grinding just to prepare for one of the most unfair final boss gauntlets in gaming. Roses is more akin to just a boss rush minus the extensive grind, with either side being beatable in under 40 minutes without using a single password or any skips, expertly shown by Clovis in their no password any percent speedrun world record. Again, this requires a ton of knowledge alongside skill to do and isn't representative of how these games would have been played on release, but it highlights the different approach taken when creating Rose's content, lining up perfectly with having less accessible passwords in the game to avoid making things too easy, especially when there is no cost for using passwords like with Star Chips and Forbidden Memories to begin with. Now, even if the devs weren't overly concerned on difficulty specifically, Roses contains a variety of unique ways to obtain cards such as the graveyard slots, reincarnation, or hidden on fields, far deeper than the simple victory drops and password options of most Yu-Gi-Oh games up to this point, which could have already been enough reason to stop players from having some level of access to every card in their physical collection. Finally, as we have learned during our password distribution hunt, the 34 release were turned into a sort of collectathon for players, needing to bring together multiple games, magazines, and follow along with online updates well past the game's release to use the password system, and this certainly fits well for a game in a franchise now tied to a collectible card game. Thus, it seems clear that despite a definitive answer for why Roses specifically didn't allow the use of physical card passwords, the game's focus on its new mechanics over things like difficulty or length provide us a reasonable explanation. Though, with that said, were the rest of those passwords ever intended to be distributed? Well, first off, it's worth a reminder that 15 cards could only be obtained via password, and after finding the origins of the last 4, we have documentation of where all of these came from, so nothing else demanded a release. But even if we assume they wanted to release them, there were only a couple of ways they might have done so given what we found: further jump issues or online updates. Regarding Jump, even looking back to where we found the 4 powerful cards starts to paint a picture, because one page before it sits an ad prepping fans for the upcoming game DM6, releasing just over 3 months since Roses released. Again, Roses never ended up being a particularly strong seller of the Yu-Gi-Oh series, ranking 24th in available sales data, 3 times lower than where Duel Monsters 6 lands, which also had over 3 times the sales across their similar lifespans. So there likely would have been more general excitement for the GBA game, even if it's far less unique, further explaining why it was already featured ahead of Roses by November. This is even seen on the November and December V-Jump covers where the 2 games are both mentioned, after which DM6 takes its place as the sole Yu-Gi-Oh game highlighted in January 2002. I was actually able to pick up a copy for us to take a look at, and while there is a page still dedicated to Roses info, and 3 more passwords that had already been revealed months earlier on the website like we saw with the November Exodia info, the Roses page itself only covers a fun mechanic for using memory cards to unlock unique CPUs, but the title distinctly notes that this is the final guide for the game. And supporting that idea, the missing insert here also now covers DM6, unlike the previous 2 months featuring Roses and presumably the online passwords. As expected, the February 02 issue continues in this direction, holding another DM6 insert with what appears to be a guide through the Ghoul portion of the campaign. It's clear that this cycle of moving on to the next game after a few months was the trend and a necessity for Yu-Gi-Oh games of this era, highlighting just how many were being pumped out and needing promotion. Looking forward a bit, almost none of Rose's staff seemed to have worked on the following GBA games, as they likely had their hands full with the next console game, Falsebound Kingdom, another non-standard Yu-Gi-Oh game with completely different mechanics that would release in December of 02, just over a year after Roses. Thus, by the time the final passwords were shared online in January of 2002, the same month as V-Jump's final guide, it was clear that Rose's promotional time was at its end. In fact, the last update to the official site overall seems to be passwords, and even more, it made a clear point in stating that players could already have 100%ed their collections by now, which holds up as these last 4 passwords weren't any of the password exclusive cards, all of which were already distributed. You might be wondering though, with all of Rose's unique methods for obtaining cards and only 34 passwords given out, did they really think players would have completed their collections in just 4 months? And actually, they might have. Because if you recall, the guidebooks we purchased last time, which released just 5 days after the game, features each card's acquisition method and labels those that were password only or unobtainable, meaning that from the perspective of the team, players had everything needed to complete the game. So with the likelihood of not wanting Roses to be any easier or losing potential content, the game on its way out of the Yu-Gi-Oh promotional cycle by February 2002, and the team eventually putting out another unique game the following year, it seemed to add up that there were never intentions of releasing the remaining passwords anyways. But that leaves us with one last turn, and it might be the most complicated yet. We already know that all 854 cards have passwords that remain unique to Roses to this day, which makes sense from a development standpoint, as it would have been easier to apply one encryption algorithm over the full set rather than assign a select few cards new passwords that they may or may not even release. So given that all 854 have a password, what is going on with the 120 cards with passwords that don't actually work in-game? Well, to start, none of these were technically even known about until GMS showed up, which brought to light that there was a specific flag determining if passwords will work or not, which we will call password on or password off respectively. Now, given it's even less likely we find any developer documentation for these more specific choices, my game plan was set, attempting to see if we could find reasonings for why these cards were seemingly selected to be even more exclusive and hopefully provide us one final glimpse into the thought process behind this game. Starting off, the 120 password off cards can be broken into two major categories, the first being 74 of varying acquisition methods and quality. Yeah, we're talking about you again, Mon Larvis. And the second being 46 completely unobtainable cards, which are corroborated by both the guidebook, GMS's work, and of course the community's 20 plus years of testing. Compared to the pretty disparate selection of obtainable cards, the unobtainable simply can't be collected and placed in a deck, instead having various ways of being used in a duel, including every ritual monster, some fusion-locked monsters, a variety of unique summoning mechanics, and relatively specific to generically strong destiny draw options, which all supports the idea of turning off their passwords to ensure they are only used in these ways, even though we now know the passwords would never be distributed officially. But there is one other unobtainable card, Kinetic Soldier, which doesn't have any kind of method to be used in a duel outside of stealing it from an opponent via Mimicat, which can be done for any card played against you in a game. And while a strong card, Kinetic doesn't seem to have a clear reason for why it wouldn't be obtainable. It's also rather similar to one of those Destiny Draw only cards, Forest Sprite, both getting a huge attack boost versus a specific monster type, so it almost seems like Kinetic Soldier was intended to be another Destiny Draw exclusive card, which at least leaves us with some solid theories for the 46 completely unobtainable cards, but no real insight on the 74 obtainable password off cards. That is, until I remembered something about Kinetic Soldier, as it's one of the 5 world premiere promotional cards included with Roses in Japan, and while the other 4 cards are obtainable, only 2 were password on, one being Fairy King Truesdale, which is only obtained as a starter deck leader, and the other being Slate Warrior, one of just 5 non-alphanumeric passwords in the game, obtained by beating Forbidden Memories, thus we would expect it to be password on. So aside from those, the world premiere cards we have seen tend to be password off, because if we jump back to those 2 Destiny Draw monsters, they also hadn't been available at the time of Rose's release, both cards coming from either of the next 2 OCG core booster sets, Mythological Age in November 2001 or Pharaonic Guardian in March 2002. Wait, Pharaonic Guardian? That's it! See, Roses contains one new monster type that has never been used elsewhere, Immortals. A group of 11 strange monsters which can't be destroyed on crushed terrain, normally doing so to monsters with 1500 attack or more, and tend to have card art which only becomes fully understood in their 3D models. Now, all but one of these have physical releases, being the obvious boss monster, Carrot Idol, which only ever appears again as a spellcaster in another non-standard Yu-Gi-Oh game on the PS2 a few years later, Capsule Monster Colosseum. And for the 10 Immortals released, 3 are cards we just saw packaged with Roses, in Slate Warrior, Electromagnetic Bagworm, and Rigorous Reaver, while the rest were all released in Pharaonic Guardian, and all, except for the already explained Slate Warrior, are password off. Additionally, all these Immortals require some of the more tedious acquisition methods in Roses, further suggesting the devs intended for players to uncover these unsettling monsters rather than ever having a potential password option. But this group also continues the theory that cards released physically with the game through Pharaonic Guardian would be password off. Now, at that point, I knew of at least one more card from Pharaonic Guardian that apparently debuted in Roses, King Tiger Wanghu, but it was password on, just like Truesdale. This left me with one option, utilizing Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro Deck's fantastic API to obtain all OCG card release dates and adding them to a data frame containing Rose's cards. And after dealing with plenty of annoyances regarding card name changes, I had a new discovery. Unsurprisingly, the cards mentioned so far were not the only ones debuting in Roses to be physically released over the next 6 months, as there were 17 more, each released across Mythological Age, Pharaonic Guardian, and one other product at the start of this time frame, Structure Deck Joey. Any other cards debuting in Roses were never released and were either password on, or the Immortal boss mentioned earlier, Carrot Idol. While all but one of these soon-to-be-released cards were in fact password on, like King Tiger and Truesdale, they follow a rule of needing to be within the starting decks. What Roses fans likely already noticed is that all of these monsters are also the deck leader of each respective starter, and with Truesdale, make up every possible option. Though there were 2 spells in these premier cards, Spring of Rebirth, which was password on and still included in the Molten Behemoth deck, and a single additional password off card, which fans of the physical game will be familiar with, Creature Swap. As a player from this era, finding out that Creature Swap was first playable here already felt like a win. But even more, with all the premier cards covered, it's clear that the team only allowed these to have a working password if they were obtainable in a starter deck, leaving the rest to be discovered by players without the possibility of a password, even if never to be distributed. Altogether, these premier cards highlight a pretty unique opportunity the Roses team had, giving a first look at so many soon-to-be-released cards. But with all that said, we now have additional explanations for 3 of the more strange Unobtainable, as well as 11 of the obtainable password-off cards. However, that still left us with 63 more password-off cards to deal with. Luckily, there was an additional group sticking out within these remaining cards, Ritual Spells. Roses contains 24 of these in total, and while 18 are password off, the other 6 are password on. At first, both groups appeared similar with no differences in things like having a physical release or ritual monster stats. However, once I started looking at the acquisition methods, the answer became clear, because while the 6 password on spells can only be obtained via reincarnation, the 18 we are interested in are all tied to specific duelists in game, 17 being obtained from at least their slots, and 1 hidden on a board. And while this already proposes a rule of turning the passwords off for rituals intended as character-specific finds, it goes even further thematically. As for a card to be in the graveyard slots, the opponent must have played it. Thus, we know and can confirm that each of these characters was designed a deck with the ability to use these rituals, some of which require very specific setup. Additionally, 3 characters even hold 2 ritual spells. While it's hard to say if there were ever alternate versions of any character decks adding or removing these ritual spells, or why exactly Tristan is the only case of one being hidden on field, it seems to stand and be likely that those tied to specific characters were chosen to be password off, bringing us all the way down to just 45 more password off cards. And while it's a far cry from the full list, this is where we face some issues, because despite the solid findings so far, nothing seemed to stand out in the remaining group. If anything, I only ended up with more ideas on what possible explanations these cards might have. For example, I tried checking how many are fusion results, rare graveyard slot rewards, cards played by only one character, potential deck cost thresholds, and more. In the end, none of these create any clear rules like we found so far. Yet there are still plenty of cards here that can't be ignored, especially for some with just a single acquisition method, appearing to be almost certainly handpicked, such as the many rare slot cards like Exodius Right Leg, Dark Magician Girl, or Regeki, Reincarnation for the left leg, and character-specific cards like Weevil's Maneater Bug or Keith's Slot Machine. Even beyond these are standouts like Machine King, which has an alt art that appears to never have been reused in the franchise anywhere, or Firewing Pegasus, originally released as a prize card 2 years earlier. Actually, on that note, most of the original OCG prize cards, made up of ritual cards, some fusions, and a few others, were never printed with physical passwords to begin with, and many still never have. This could further support some decisions we already saw, and even provide new theories, like for Labyrinth Wall, which has never been printed with a password. However, it still doesn't provide a consistent rule, having plenty of exceptions, and after all this, still leaves us with password-off cards which can't quite be explained. When I contacted GMS to get their thoughts, they also felt these choices could be the creators' way of pushing players towards the unique acquisition methods required for cards in Roses. Now, at the start of this search, GMS also confirmed it wasn't at all likely for any decisions to be hidden in the game's data, which makes perfect sense as the password flag is just like any other predetermined feature of a card. Furthermore, these types of subjective and seemingly arbitrary decisions have been seen in other Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, particularly Forbidden Memory's star chip cost used for its password system, where many cards were set at the max amount, leaving some unobtainable in-game alone, and were instead accessible via a peripheral device only ever released in Japan. While digging through those and their many odd cases doesn't solve what we have left in Roses, it does further corroborate the idea of encouraging players to engage with their game's features. And of course, we can't rule out any potential mistakes given the amount of decisions seemingly being made around which cards are password on or password off. In fact, GMS also pointed out that there are some interesting occurrences within Rose's fusion system, because while Forbidden Memories held relatively consistent rules for its fusions, Rose's not only had many cases of more strict material conditions, aligning again with the idea of making things a bit less easy for this shorter game, there are also a handful of material exceptions which seem out of place. For example, Stone D now requires any rock and a dragon, with 1200 or more attack, aside from one specifically, Sky Dragon. FM, of course, had a much larger number of working materials, allowing any dragon including Sky. And when looking through the pool of dragon materials in Roses for why Sky Dragon might not be material, nothing really sticks out, seeming like either a very specific subjective choice or a mistake. Again, there are plenty of these, most of which are hard to imagine any kind of explanation for, with material exceptions that hold many of the same aspects as other cards in the accepted group, leaving us not much further than where we started with the remaining 45 password off cards. And this was the point. I had to start accepting that no matter how many solid explanations we had for some of the password off cards, others will likely never be explained completely. There's also the question of why the flags were used in the first place if the passwords were never going to be distributed. I would imagine having those flags were just part of the card planning process when curating Rose's pool, as this was their way to limit card availability, similar to max star chips in FM or other Yu-Gi-Oh! Games prior. Regardless of which order the flag assignments, full password encryption, or distribution choices were made, all of these methods work to limit card accessibility in Roses. Speaking of the encryption, the algorithm shouldn't lie anywhere within the game's files, given these passwords are hard-coded attributes of each card like the on and off flags. However, if one could decrypt Rose's passwords to the physical card passwords, while it wouldn't provide answers to our remaining cards, it could give us one last glimpse into the devs' work, and would be interesting to see if the passwords for the world premiere cards would match up or not. But since that's a bit out of my realm of expertise, I'll stick to searching the graveyard of history for today. At this point though, you might have guessed that I spent tons of research hours looking for anyone from the team who might be interested in chatting about the game, but that understandably hasn't led anywhere. And with the mountain of Yu-Gi-Oh! Games from this era, combined with their lack of documentation, at least for now, the info, theories, and history of Rose's passwords has reached its end. Despite being able to find all the distributed password origins, as well as share some of the physical media that contained them, these items and their stories weren't easily accessible. Who knows how many more tales could be hidden on similar pages or forgotten sites. But behind all of this is the creation of the game itself, something we have far less information on, and already seems to be lost to time, leaving this decades-old Yu-Gi-Oh! Game with some secrets to keep. Even still, it has more than delivered countless hours of entertainment, be it to the players and their community over the years, my friends and I digging into the game endlessly, or all the amazing people like you who care to hear this game's tales. Personally, I have always loved learning about the history surrounding a piece of media and its development, so often ending up with interesting stories about the worlds created or the creators themselves. And in the case of Roses, the sheer detachment between the still to this day popular IP and the developers of this odd but creative project is a bit painful to see. I hope one day we can learn more of their stories, thoughts, and feelings about this outlier of a game, but until then, this is where the duel finally concludes. Good game.